What's going on? And welcome back to RizzoCast. I'm Steven Rissotto. This is episode number 47. And on the 47th show, we are joined by none other than Marc Delucchi. He's a co-expert for Around the Foghorn, which is the fan-sided site that covers the San Francisco Giants. And he is doing something pretty awesome this week. He's pretty big on prospects. And this week, is Prospect Week at Around the Foghorn, where he is writing a few different articles, covering a few different topics related to the San Francisco Giants pipeline. This is the first ever Giants Prospect Week. There's a lot of in-depth coverage he's having. Every day there's a new article, state of the Giants system, 5 Giants draft trends, 5 strongest positions, unranked watch list, Mark's prospect tendencies when he's kind of constructing all of this, top 31 prospects, 5 potential draft targets, a fan chat with Mark, and finally a podcast to finalize the week there. Mark, what's going on? I know you're really busy this week with all of that. I had trouble just saying that in one breath. What's going on with you? How you doing?
A lot of writing, a lot, it's the thing about prospects, especially like the ranking season is it's always, when it's going to come, like I knew when I was going to try to release it. And so, you spend the off season, you're gathering data, you're trying to obviously talk to industry sources, try to gauge sort of, where different evaluators are at, obviously since people inside the organization are really, not likely to speak about players, you're working, with other organizations and trying to gauge, all right, how familiar is this person with, a Giants player or whatnot. So, I have a lot of time spent on it, but the writing part, I always push off a bit. And so this week is a lot of kind of going back and putting all these things into the sentences beyond just the bullet points I have in my notes with, from various conversations or reading other people.
Yeah, for sure. So what kind of started your fascination with prospects? I know there's a ton of people that of course scout for a career, obviously, but there's also people in the media that cover, prospects on a daily basis and get paid for it. So what is kind of your fascination and how did you get started with evaluating prospects?
Yeah, I mean, my dad's a diehard Giants fan, and so that kind of just passed on to me just through kind of following his passion for sports. He grew up in Sonoma, Giants, Warriors, 49ers fan, and so that I just kind of followed in that. And I'm born and raised in Hawaii, and so one of the things about that is there's not a lot of professional sports out here, and we try to make, since most of my family was in the Bay Area and still is to a certain degree, we'd go there every summer for about a month or two and see family. And so, I'd catch a San Jose Giants game here and there, a San Francisco Giants game, especially when they were bad and tickets were a bit cheaper. But, being out here, the one thing we did get was Hawaii Winter Baseball for about a 3-year pocket there. And so I got to see Buster Posey the winter after he was drafted by the Giants. Roger Kieschnick was another big Giants prospect from that draft. So, kind of that started it, I'd say. I mean, I've always been kind of a junkie for kind of the behind the scenes, like figuring out the salary caps of various sports and figuring out how things work. You can see a bunch of the Baseball America prospects handbooks behind me. And so that kind of just got me on this path. And I sort of saw myself a few years ago as I went off to college, heading into a front office, sort of trying to maybe pursue to be a scout and maybe work my way up the chain that way, or in maybe combining some analytics tools to work in the front office that way. And I've kind of moved away from that. But as I moved towards writing, I realized that kind of my experience gave me a good set of eyes to write about this stuff, because I was approaching this for so long as like, I want to get better so I can be contributing well to a front office, to a big league team. And now that I'm writing, I'm like, all right, let me share the perspective that, I would have hoped to bring, and sort of the things I've learned that way.
Yeah, we're like 5 minutes in and you already dropped Roger Kieschnick's name. So this is pretty awesome. Yeah, that was, by the way, just a side note, that was a great time for Giants prospects, in terms of like irrelevance, right? Like it's fun naming off Francisco Peguero
Yeah.
and Tommy Joseph and all those, Nick Noonan. I mean,
Chris Dominguez, the big
Chris
power.
Dominguez, yes, the corner infielder, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it and that's kind of the sense that I feel like it's fun to talk about prospects, because even the ones that don't pan out, I mean, we could go back and look at, how dumb we were, how dumb
Yeah.
we looked, but it's definitely a lot of fun. So yeah, you mentioned your background in scouting. Expand more on how I don't want to give away one of your articles that's
No, go
coming out
ahead.
this week. Expand more on like kind of how you like to evaluate players and some methods you use while watching a baseball game. Say you're sitting right behind the
Right.
dish, you got your radar gun, whatever you have with you, your stopwatch. How are you evaluating a player?
Yeah, and I'm happy to do this one because this especially is something, it's like I want to start sort of normalizing people who evaluate prospects talking about not only their process, but like really getting into, all right, where do I tend to go wrong, right? And so, I was someone, I come of age in kind of the Moneyball era, right? When if you're growing up, if you're born probably in the early to 90s to early 2000s, right? You're kind of you know baked into fandom is this analytical approach and this new age thing. And the last few years, like a lot of that's come into question. We've sort of started reconsidering what are the side effects, what are potentially the adverse consequences of this approach, both in terms of talent evaluation and also maybe what it's doing to the game. And I think the Astros as an organization are kind of the perfect example of what we've realized. Oh, this is when that goes to that extreme to a certain degree. And so early on, I was someone who, just as a fan, because I couldn't see most of these guys, my process was a lot of, it was box score sounding when I was a kid. I was just looking for guys who walked a lot, who didn't strike out, and if they could hit for power. And, over time, there's only so many kind of times you fall in love with a Matt Duffy, and that player doesn't become Matt Duffy, who's, actually had a pretty good big league career, before you start reevaluating, thinking, this isn't as simple as a stat sheet. This isn't as simple as something, you can model up in a simple multiple regression or really any model. And so in college, I was lucky enough to be a part of a startup originally called the Collegiate Baseball Scouting Network. They renamed to Evolution Metrics before they folded. And so for 3 years, I worked as an amateur scout sort of for 3 draft cycles, primarily watching low tier college, D2, D3 college, and high schoolers here, prep players here in Hawaii. And it was honestly it's a massive challenge, right? Because their essential model was, let's take college kids who love baseball, let's teach them to scout and give them this experience. And I'm incredibly grateful for it, because when you learn how hard it is really quickly, like you learn just like, catching your eye for bat speed and things is something that you're really not trained to do and not necessarily thinking about as a fan. But as I did it more and more, if you see enough players, there was, I think one time I saw, I want to say 15 games in 10 days was kind of the peak of when I did it. When you watch that much baseball, you do get bored of baseball. At least I did. And that's probably why I ended up not becoming a scout. But also you begin to sort of just like very small differences in how people perform, whether it's speed, whether it is bat speed, whether it is, the feel for a breaking ball, they do become a bit easier to discern. And so, really for me, it's what I noticed when I've gotten a chance to watch a lot of baseball in a short period of time. Because the problem I've had, for most of my life as a fan, in terms of, I was a fan, so not thinking about it in terms of scouting terms, but if you only get one game and that's the only real baseball game, especially pro level baseball game you're watching in a short span of time, it's really easy to fall in love with whoever the best player on the field is that day. And you're not necessarily getting a sense for, how they're performing every day, or even how to calibrate them relative to other players around the league. And that's been what's so difficult this past couple of years, because, as I've sort of gotten really into this, there hasn't been minor league baseball. And so, for the past couple of years, it's been a lot of, even more forcing me to kind of try to, build relationships with people who have seen these players or who have a lot of experience in this, and then doing a lot of video scouting. And so that's where, you're looking for, all right, our guys, taking good pitches. When guys are overly aggressive, is it because they're not recognizing the pitch, because they're too confident in their ability to maybe drive a pitch on the outside corner, things like that. On the pitching side, you're trying to notice, is there a mechanical thing that could change, that could maybe add some velocity? Are they locating to both sides, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. And I I'm 18. I was born in 2002, so that's right around when Moneyball
Yep.
was written. And I read the book, and I think that the most interesting thing about Moneyball is at the beginning when Michael Lewis is talking about all the cliches of scouting,
Mm-hmm.
right? Good body, hot girlfriend,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. So how have you, like, is there any like old school scouting, the majority of what am I trying to say here? Scouting is often regarded as an old school tool, right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, you look and there's stats now.
Mm-hmm.
There's analytics that colleges have. They're tracking it, TrackMan.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over the place. So how do you blend the two, analytics with kind of the old school approach to scouting? Because I know there's a lot of different ways. Because if it was all new school, scouts would be abolished. There would be
Yeah.
none in the stands. So
And
what
there
is
are teams that have employed that, right? The Astros were kind of the
Mhm.
first to really cut down their scouting departments. And yeah, I follow someone who was pretty influential for me is the prospect people who've been over at Fangraphs, Kylie McDaniel and Eric, I want to say Longenhagen. I've actually never said the name out loud. I think I said it right. But anyway, because they talk about, how the best approach to me, and they wrote a book called Future Value as well that I'd recommend for someone thinking about this kind of thing, is that viewing them as either or is kind of how Moneyball frames it, and part of that I think is how the A's viewed it, but I also think part of it is just this is written by Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis is trying to create a narrative, and narratives kind of are generally more intriguing if people frame them antagonistically, right? And the reality is a lot more complicated. I think one thing that is a common, I think, misnomer and frustration for as someone who has a quantitative statistical background, when people, kind of dismiss it and just say, oh, it's just analytics. If you look at batting average, if you look at hits, if you look at a guy's scouting report and it says a 60 future value, that is an analytic, like
It's
an
all
analytic
analysts.
or
Yeah.
statistic, right? Any number you are using is a data point. It's just sort of what we're doing with it. And so, I've my sort of approach is trying to blend them as best I can. And I have tendencies because my foundation is much more in the data analysis side. And I was actually working on my tendencies draft that's going to go up in a couple of days, like you mentioned. And one of the things I'm talking about is I've always been a sucker for two things: age and low strikeout rates. And if you're hitting for power while you're doing that, that's really going to get my attention. And I think my rankings spell that out in terms of which players are a bit higher than you might expect. And, part of that is we know historically that tends to, bear out a bit. But it's also because I can look at someone like Elliot Ramos and say, if he stalls at AA for the next two seasons, and I realize minor league baseball's, we don't know what the season's going to look, but let's say there's full season and he plays at AA and he just doesn't really take a step forward. He's still like 23, right? He's still 24. Like, he's the age of Joey Bart right now. Where if Joey Bart has two seasons where he struggles at AAA, he's 26. And, we've seen Mike Yastrzemski, we've seen Donovan Solano, right, prove you can still become a contributor later in your career. But there's no doubt that that's a harder trajectory for me to envision in a prospect. And so I'd say those are the big ones where you kind of I look for warning signs in the data. I look for what player, how old is the player? What's the kind of competition they've seen before? And then who are they playing against? Strikeout rate and walk rate are two big ones. Are they hitting for power? But then you do have to really get in and watch the swings, watch the at-bats as much as you can and try to see, I think Gary Brown is a perfect example, to use another old Giants prospect name, a guy who tore up at San Jose at high A. The Giants chose essentially to trade Zach Wheeler instead of Brown because they believed in his offensive potential. And Brown had a hitch in his swing, was a bit aggressive. And, some scouts said from, when he was in college, I believe at Cal State Fullerton, that was going to become a problem against upper level pitching. And it eventually did. And so, you do have to kind of keep those things in mind. I do, though. I try to kind of do 50-50, but I will use analytics to break it. I just fell for it. I used analytics, but I will use sort of the statistic tendencies I have to break ties. When I'm saying, these two players I like or these three players, I really like them. So who's the youngest is going to break that tie. Or if one has a higher strikeout rate, that one's going to be lower. Or if one is showing a better rate of walking, that one's probably going to be a bit higher.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the days of scouting in terms of this guy's going to hit 25 and knock in 85.
Yeah.
Those days are over. Like nobody cares about how many runs you're going to knock in. It's out of context completely.
Mhm.
And by the way, that went full circle because Gary Brown is now scouting, I believe, with the New York
Oh,
Mets.
I think so. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting for sure. So let's get into the Giants system here. First few pieces, you gave a lot of credit to Bobby Evans and that kind of brief era, the bridge between Sabian and Zaidi, the brief era right before the Zaidi administration. And you gave them a lot of credit. Tell me a little bit more, God, I cannot speak English today,
It's all
Mark. I don't know
good.
tell me a little bit more about that bridge that you noticed in the Bobby Evans era and why that's kind of still he still kind of has a hand in what the Giants are today.
Yeah, I think if anyone gets shortchanged in Giants to most Giants fans, it is Bobby Evans in part because, Sabian gets the credit for the World Series team. Sabian gets the credit for the 2002 and, the early Bonds era teams. Evans was an assistant general manager for those 3 World Series teams as well. He was a primary part of that front office too. And Sabian essentially steps aside and hands the reins to Evans, in frankly a terrible situation. He hands it over to Evans with an aging roster that Sabian had already mostly signed to extensions, and a farm system that was lacking big time upside and lacking a lot of had already been a lot of the top talents had already been traded and moved Sabian had made. And so, Evans goes out and he signs Jeff Samardzija and Johnny Cueto in his first free agency, right? And people will look back. I think the Cueto signing and Samardzija signings both have obviously not worked out ideally for the Giants, but I think to frame those signings as complete whiffs, I think is also a bit of a mischaracterization, right? Like the Giants needed innings, and Samardzija gave it to them for 2 seasons. Then he kind of fell apart near the end. Whenever you're going to the free agent market, you're generally paying for front line or early returns and later losses, and I think that's what the Giants got, right? Cueto and Samardzija were a huge part of why they made the playoffs in 2016, and why if you wonder what the bullpen looks like, then you wonder where that season ends if it isn't for the meltdown in Game 4, I believe, of the NLDS against the Cubs. And then he goes out and signs Mark Melancon. He makes the Andrew McCutchen trade. He makes the infamous Matt Moore trade. But when we look back at a lot of these moves, I'm not saying he won every trade, but I think you can see a pretty clear tendency where a few exceptions, the Casey McGee trade, that one mainly parting with Luis Castillo remains to be right. That's no doubt the worst move of his tenure. Although it's worth pointing out, the Marlins traded Luis Castillo the next winter for Dan Straley. So, I think you got to give credit to Castillo and potentially even what the Reds player development system has been able to do to work with him as well. And, he was a huge proponent for expanding the player development staff, for investing in the minor leagues, because he saw how bare the farm system was. And what I credit Zaidi for when he stepped in a bit differently than I think most Giants fans do is they say Zaidi came in and he changed how the farm system worked. He changed the player development apparatus. He changed the scouting department. In truth, Zaidi actually kept a lot of the same people in place, kept expanding, and just built upon what Evans had already begun to do with the organization's infrastructure, obviously with some different emphasis. He's, clearly put a priority on plate discipline, clearly put a priority on putting the ball in play in a way that Evans did not to the same degree. And Zaidi's made a number of really good trades. But, again, when you look at this farm system, the top prospects, the guys that we're thinking about, are mostly acquired either under Evans' tenure or near the end of Sabian's, not Zaidi's. And again, there's Patrick Bailey's and some of the top picks. But, Gregory Santos is acquired in the Eduardo Nunez trade, where Evans got Santos and Sean Anderson for a rental Eduardo Nunez, right? Like, that's a really good trade. We look back at selling Andrew McCutchen. He trades at the end of the waiver wire, basically trades a month and a half of Andrew McCutchen for Abiatel Avelino, who, had a cup of coffee with the Giants, and Jorge DePaula, who Zaidi would trade for Kevin Pillar the next season. So I do think Evans gets shortchanged a bit, because I think when Evans got let go and Zaidi gets brought in, it signals a change from ownership in the organization, that they were willing to take a step back, finally willing to say, we're not going to keep betting on trying to win next season. We're going to maybe give Zaidi a chance to kind of step back and let things reset. And I am left wondering if Evans had gotten that chance, how things would have played out.
Yeah, definitely an interesting hypothetical for sure. So Michael Holmes is the new scouting director, and you wrote an article about kind of a few of the trends that we've seen from Michael Holmes thus far. Maybe point out a few of them. What's some of the major themes that you've seen under the Michael Holmes scouting director administration?
Yeah, well, I'd say the biggest one and the most notable win, I guess the most notable one that Giants fans who follow the big league team closest will be familiar with is on the pitching side. The sort of tendency to target secondary pitches above fastball velocity, being okay with a guy throwing 90, 92, 91, 94, but having a good feel for a breaking ball has been a priority at the big league level. We saw this offseason with guys like Matt Whistler, and a number of the minor league free agents, Jay Jackson, Dominic Leone come to mind. That's trickled down, and that's played out in Holmes's 2 drafts as well. The top pitchers he's targeted, the Trevor McDonald's, the Nick Swineys, the Kyle Harrison, excuse me. All of those guys, none of them had or projected to have premium fastballs out when they were drafted. Now, Harrison, to the Giants' credit, has shown 97 in instructs, but that wasn't something that anyone really talked about leading up to the draft. They all, though, had a pretty advanced feel for secondary offerings. And I think that's, I'd say, the biggest thing that you're seeing a sort of dogma at the big league level. We're seeing kind of Holmes carry that out on the amateur side. The other thing, though, on the offensive side, we're seeing a lot of carryover from John Barr, who was the previous scouting director, who has stayed within the organization and played a pretty prominent role in the 2019 draft. We've seen a lot of similar targeted guys who played for 3 years in college, were pretty strong performers, oftentimes a power over hit profile with a few exceptions to that. They seem to still kind of following a lot of those same patterns. And to be fair, Barr's the guy who drafted Buster Posey and Brandon Crawford and Brandon Belt, and lower rounds, Adam Duvall and Matt Duffy and Kelby Tomlinson, So, Barr had a strong track record offensively. It was really the, pitching side of things where he was really never able in one of his drafts, the Giants really never added a future big league starter with the exception of Zach Wheeler. And so that's where you would expect the Giants to need the biggest changes. And that's where we've seen it under Holmes.
Yeah, some good points made there. I like what you said about the one pitch, focusing on a secondary pitch. We saw Whistler's 86% slider usage and Jake McGee's 85% fastball usage. And I also think they're getting both, they're getting relievers that could get both hitters out, right-handed and left-handed hitters. The 3-batter minimum is going to change a lot of things. I think Harlan Garcia gets both left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters out. Jake McGee could do the same thing. So I think that's definitely interesting and a nice trend too that we're going to see through the minor leagues. How did the alternative training site and COVID kind of mess up any development, or did it mess up any development on some of the young talent?
Well, that's a we'll see. I mean, we really don't know, right? I mean, we really don't have a precedent for this. And, I think The Athletic, a few people did an article, I want to say, Sarah's Melissa Lockhart, and I think Britt Urol also. But anyway, kind of looking back at like the wartime breaks that we saw, but in, back to World War II and World War I. But obviously those aren't, equivalent because, if minor league players, a lot of them were still able to work out on their own or, go to various facilities, wartime. That was obviously not something that a lot of people, were doing, especially at the minor league level. Right. So I honestly don't have a good answer for you. My, I guess, hypothesis is that we're going to see a strange sort of divergence where you're going to see some prospects who, and, I guess sort of the darker side of this, the darker reality is that I haven't really seen talked about, is that a lot of this is going to come along the lines of privilege, right? Like if you got a big signing bonus, or if you're from a relatively wealthy family, you were probably able to afford to live with a coach or live in an area with a drive line or a push performance, or you could basically spend the entire year and a half treating it like you had an off-season workout. Versus on the flip side, guys who didn't get a big signing bonus, or players who can't afford or couldn't afford to do that, who were trying to, pursue their other careers to make ends meet, probably had to work out once or twice a week, probably didn't get to see any real high level pitching. And so I wouldn't be shocked if we see a pretty big group of these top prospects throughout baseball, not just the Giants, have explosive, what we seem to be like, this guy was at, high A and now he's tearing up triple A pitching or something to that effect. And then we see the flip side where we see some guys who were doing really well at high A and double A, who they come back and they're struggling to hit short season pitching, or I guess, low A, or what was low A, now class A pitching. And so I think, it's really going to be, the individual basis on so many of these, because it's ultimately just, what were players able to do based on their circumstances, and, a lot of that being out of their control. And so I think that's really how this is going to play out. And I think if that's the case, that probably puts the Giants in a pretty good position, because they prioritize prospects at the alternate site in a way that no other team did, right? They had, I think, 4 or 5 of their top offensive prospects in the alternate site, basically getting to work with AAA or borderline big league competition. And so I think that's going to pay dividends for those guys. But for the rest of the system, for the vast majority of prospects, I think it's really up in the air.
Yeah, and I talked to Chris Shaw during the season, and he was upset because he was like the only guy he was one of 2, or maybe he was the only guy from the 40-man roster that was not at the alternative training site. So that gives you an indication on how they did utilize the prospects down there. So starting pitching, is there anything in this system that is more than a mid-rotation starter? Because I know we've seen Seth Corey in and out of the top 100. I mean, maybe not your top 100, but Major League Baseball, MLB.com's top 100. We get some, information about Sean Jelly and where he's at, and kind of a quirky, coming from up top, really tall guy. So where is the status right now? What's the status right now of the pitching staff in the minor league level? Is there anybody that is a 2, maybe even a mid, maybe even a 3? Like, is there any promise in this staff, or is that something they're going to have to go down, maybe the free agency rabbit hole down the road?
Yeah, well, this is where I guess things get bare, in that there are some people I talked to who were fairly straightforward in saying they didn't see a future big league starter in the Giants system,
Wow.
and, or, maybe a fringe 4 or 5, Jelly kind of being that guy. But there are a lot of people who think Seth Corey is an ace reliever. They think, Gregory Santos, Kevin Castro are ace relievers. Frankly, I was beginning to get really excited because I thought Santos and Castro were ready to have breakouts this season after how strong they performed in Instructs. And it looks like that's the case, except the Giants have seemed to say and hint that those guys are only relievers now. They're going to let them develop as relievers. And frankly, that's a bit disappointing to me, because Santos has always been someone I've been really high on. Castro was someone who had a really good feel for pitching, and I thought could be a 4, maybe even a 3 if everything worked out. And so I kind of had to adjust my rankings accordingly. I had both of them a lot higher than they end up, because it seems like the Giants are signaling they are full-time relievers now. I will say this. I think that starting pitching is the thing we've figured out the least when it comes to projecting prospects. One of the other things in sort of the tendencies I talk about is I go back and I read a lot of these old Baseball America prospects handbooks just to see who we got right and who we got wrong. And I'm trying to figure out, all right, some guys just get hurt. Some guys, there's things behind the scenes that we don't know about. Some guys this, but are there tendencies here? And pitching, it's just, there's a lot of risk. And there's also, if I showed you if I took Madison Bumgarner when he was at his peak in 2014, and I threw him on, a showcase mound, fans aren't going to get excited about it. The scouts would. They'd see the feel, they'd see the break, they'd see the deception. But, he was, mostly 92, 94, and often 90, 93, with a funky arm ankle. And so, you'd look at that guy and you'd say, oh, this is going to be a really tough loogie, right? This is going to be maybe a Jeremy Affeldt type. I don't think we have a firm grasp of that. Obviously, scouts, are better at this than fans watching video. But I do think there's something to be said for. It's just, we have you look at most of the top kind of pitchers. I mean, the draft is a perfect example of this. We look back at all of the top 10 picks, the top high school pitchers is always the one people will point to as this high bust category. And again, I think that's a bit deceiving. I actually think teams should target high school pitchers a bit more than they do at the top of the draft. That's kind of a tendency for me, because I think, pitching development is something that, one, we've taken a lot of strides in over the past few years in understanding how players can improve to maximize deception, to maximize spin, and all these other things. To the Giants' point, though, the top pitching prospect in the system for my ranking is not going to be Seth Corey. It's going to be Kyle Harrison. And, that's a really small sample. Again, I've yet to see this guy play professionally. I've yet to see Kyle Harrison, right? This is all video and what I've heard from people. But it seems like, the people who are in Southern California who were watching that region thought if there had been a full spring season, Harrison would have ended up being viewed as a first-round prospect, as a first-round pick, and that the Giants kind of bet on that momentum when they selected him in the third round and essentially paid him late first-round money. And, again, in Instructs, he hit 97. And, from what people saw there, they saw the advanced makeup and feel, for pitching that he'd flashed in high school. And so he's the guy who I'd say, if you're looking at a starter, this guy's still a teenager. This guy's now shown premium velocity in the fastball, but more importantly, has been credited for, the other things as well.
So you also mentioned drafting relief pitchers, and no high cost relievers anymore in the draft. They're not paying, big money for relievers in the draft anymore. Yep. Now that Michael Holmes has taken over and the Zaidi administration has taken over. This, I think, is a great idea, because I feel like relievers are just such chess pieces. I mean, look at right now in camp. You could easily point to 20 guys right now that you could throw in a big league bullpen and you're fine with it. So I think, we looked at Trevor Gott. Trevor Gott looked like a nice find at one point. And now, you place him on waivers. He gets outrighted back down to Sacramento, keep him in the organization, and you have a chance to add him at the 40-man roster, and that's a competent big league reliever. Some may differ. Of course, we've seen blowups, but whatever. That's outside the point. But I like this trend. Is this a trend that you see as a positive reflection on where the Giants are heading in terms of scouting relievers?
Yeah, I definitely do. And again, with the noted caveats, as I say in the article, we really only have 2 drafts and really 1 draft and a weird kind of pseudo draft this past year because of COVID. And so, my main thing with these trends is like things to watch, because, we could see Michael Holmes go off and draft 3 relievers in rounds 7 through 10 this year, or, 4 through 5, 4 and 5. And then we're kind of right back where we were in the Bart administration. So I think that's worth pointing out. And again, RJ Dobovich was someone I talk about. They used the 4th round pick on this year, but to me, that's an underslot guy they used to kind of pay Harrison, to pay, other players. So I don't view that in the same way as, like Heath Hembry or Jason Stoffel, who were 2 high round selections under Bar. I do for sort of a similar reason, is that, look, I think most big league relievers, most of the best big league relievers were drafted, developed, and some even pitched in the big leagues as starting pitchers, right? Andrew Miller is kind of the modern kind of turning point, I think, of a lot of people realizing this.
Zach Britton.
Yeah, exactly. Zach Britton, right? Aroldis Chapman is signed out of Cuba and spends his first year in the Cincinnati Reds rotation before he ends up as a closer. So, I think it's something to be said for is that, if you end up in a bullpen, it's probably because the coach, for whatever reason, doesn't think you can handle a 6 or 7 inning, going through a lineup 2 or 3 times. Well, if that's true at the high school level, especially, but especially even at the college level, then I think it's worth pondering whether that's going to be an issue going forward. What was interesting about the picks under Bar, is that a number of guys who were relievers in college, the Giants tried to convert back to starting pitchers. Chase Johnson was a closer in the Big West who they moved back to the starting rotation. Dan Slania was a closer at Notre Dame who, after a couple years out of the bullpen for the Giants, they moved to the starting rotation and had glimpses, which I just think, if it had worked, it would have been quite impressive. If they could figure that part out, that'd be, you could draft relievers and then turn them into starters. That would be an incredible way to find value in the draft. But I just haven't seen someone have success with that as a model. And so I think, it's more straightforward to say, let's target the starters and figure if the starters don't work out, we'll still have some relievers on our hands. And I think that's what we saw towards the end of Bar's tenure. That was something that faded as we got deeper into the 2010s towards 2014 and 15. In fact, we saw in Bar's last draft, they draft a bunch of college starters who probably project as relievers in Blake Rivera and Keaton Wynn and Garrett Cave and players like that. So, I do think it's a positive sign because it's recognizing it's a lot harder to find a college reliever who's going to be a big league starter than the other way around.
Yeah. Remember when every big league offense just couldn't wait to get to the bullpen on every start? Like now it's just, you don't want to see them, but it's such a misconception that, well, I guess it's not a misconception because it is kind of true, as you mentioned, that relievers are failed starters. And that's believable to a point, but I just think the mentality is now different because these guys, they get shifted to the bullpen, but their mentality completely shifts. They start throwing harder. They start relying more on secondary pitches. It's completely different because
people, I think, are also I think it's also a misnomer that I think there are some starters who wouldn't be very good relievers. I think, to treat these things as if they're doing the same job. It's like there's an intrinsically different mental, but also physical thing of going in for essentially one inning, whatever the situation is, and often pitching for the strikeout, the punch out, versus being someone who you have to have the patience with yourself and, with the team to know if I give up a couple of runs this inning in the first inning, I still got to keep going. I think it's a bit easier to say, or I guess it's easy to say the failed starter thing, but I do think there's something to be said for it's not as simple as, all right, this guy's a mediocre starter, he'll be a good reliever.
Yeah, for sure. So next question I want to ask you is, who is the most underrated prospect in this system? First and foremost, Brandon Crawford was never on top of anybody's prospect list. Matt Duffy was never on top of any prospect list. There's a dozen. Adam Duvall, yep, 100%. There's a ton of people like this for every team. We could go down each team and find, 5 guys that were not big top prospects. So who is that guy in this Giants system?
I'll give you a few different types of underrated. I'll say, because when we do the underrated thing, we always go to the bottom of the list. I'm actually going to go to near the top of my list. I think Luis Matos is someone we're underrating in part because of the presence of Elliot Ramos and Hunter Bishop, who are former first-round picks who play the same position, who've obviously had, longer track records with Ramos in the pros, with Bishop in college. And, I guess I'll give this as a spoiler. Matos is my second-ranked prospect. I have him above both Bart and Ramos. I think, he's someone who has the closest thing to a 5-tool package that is in the Giants system. And so I view him not quite on Luciano, not quite on Marco Luciano's tier, but a lot closer than I think people realize. Going down the list, I'll point to someone who I was hesitant to get on board with, was skeptical of, and that was Casey Schmidt, the Giants' second-round pick in this past year's draft. As I sort of looked more into his profile and his potential, I think the Giants are quite confident in his ability to develop a strong above average to plus hit tool that will allow his strong power to play. And he's really strong defensively. I think he's someone who we could be looking back and saying he became a lot better than we realized. And then sort of after that, we just get to the international free agent signings of the last 2 years that haven't gotten to play. So, that's the, Adrian Sugaste, Rainer Santana, guys like that who, I think if they got in a minor league season last year, there's probably a 1 or 2 of them who we'd be talking about in the top 10, maybe even higher on this list. It's just, we didn't get that to look at.
Now I'll flip it on you. Overrated. And this is really tricky because I don't know if it would fall under the same category as possible bust. Right. Maybe it does. I don't know. I guess it's different for everybody.
I'll say this. I've been low on Joey Bart since the Giants drafted him. And it's not because I don't think he's going to be a good big league player. It's because I thought he had a much smaller path to being an elite player than I think people gave him credit for. We're talking about him, right, when you saw in college as a guy who wouldn't hit necessarily for a high average, but could hit 25 to maybe even 30 home runs if it all came together. And there's just not a lot of catchers out there. You can really only point to Gary Sanchez as a guy with a similar profile. And I think Sanchez, was an incredible prospect. Again, Bart is right above Ramos. He's my third-ranked prospect. I went back and forth between him and Ramos at 3 and 4. Who knows? I might end up changing it before then. I'm still kind of jostling between them and that 50-plus future value. But I think people have confidence in Bart as they might have in Posey about a decade ago, or just over a decade ago at this point. And I just like reiterate, like, these are not similar prospects, because Posey had the advanced hit tool, and the question was, how much power would he be able to bring into games? And it turned out about, league average for the most part, obviously above average for a usual catcher. Bart, the question is, how much hit tool will he have to allow his power to play? And I think that's a much more common problem and a much more difficult one for players to improve upon. And so I think Bart, is probably very likely to become a average everyday big league catcher, a good shot to become an above average one. But I do think he is not, when you look at the similar trajectories between him and Posey, making the debuts where they struggle in small samples, and having some strong winter league or fall league performances relatively soon after their drafts. I think people are putting Bart on a tier with Luciano. And while Luciano's farther removed in terms of ceiling, I think people are putting a bit higher stakes into Joey Bart than I think I would.
So let's talk more about Bart here real quick. Patrick Bailey's now also in the system, and I know a lot of people kind of shrug their shoulders as to why are the Giants getting another catcher. Honestly, I think it's interesting because, who knows, maybe one of them could be dealt for pitching. We never know what's going to happen with some of these guys. So what is the thought between those two? Like, maybe the question should be, why was Patrick Bailey drafted?
I think it's not too complicated. They really like Patrick Bailey, and Bailey, a key component. Bailey was willing to take a below slot signing bonus that would enable them to go above slot later for Kyle Harrison. I don't think they identified. My understanding of it is they didn't, know Kyle Harrison was going to be the guy, but they knew there were a lot of high school pitchers, and they wanted to get one of them, and because they knew all of them wouldn't get taken in those top 2 rounds. And so they said, we're going to target someone in the first round who we believe is a top 15 who deserves to go with this pick. And if we can get someone to take a low enough number where we'll know we have $2 or $2.5 million to give someone later, that's who we're going to go with. And so they went with Bailey because I think they genuinely like Bailey. I think he has he kind of has a somewhat similar profile to Bart to some. Others sort of put it in reverse. He's really weird in that you've seen some who say he has the kind of below average hit tool with above average power, and you see others who really like the hit tool but think he's probably has 40 grade power that's just playing up because of how advanced his hit tool is. So again, I'm really interested to see him, if we can get him to play some minor league games this year against some minor league competition, because again, I was, scouting a couple of years ago, but, not watching a lot of college games recently. It's harder for me to watch Bailey's college tape and come away with a scouting report I'm really confident in. So I have to rely more than usual on the people I talk to.
Yeah. And catchers, historically take a while to develop. James McCann just got his first, just got his first big deal. He's 30 years old. He just kind of came up as of late, the last, 2-3 years. So it takes a little time, and I think we're going to get a better understanding in 5 years of where Joey Bart is, maybe even 3 years.
Sorry to, I guess, get back to the core of your original question, though. I think the Zaidi, we've talked about before the podcast, what are they going to do with this glut of corner outfielders, these Jason Fosters, these Darren Ruffs? I think if you get to the heart of the issue, and this is sort of, I guess, the largest component of, what people think of as Moneyball, that is really sort of carrying over in this Giants front office, is I think a lot of that they're ignoring about, do we already have a guy or not? They're looking at this. Can we get a player who we think is better than the price we're going to have to pay if they're good value? If we can trade a piece and get something back that we think is better, we're going to make that trade 80 to 90% of the time, regardless of the position either one plays. And then if we get to a place where we're, in a World Series hunt, we need this, then okay, we can get more aggressive. And so I really do think, drafting Bailey, already having Bart, Ricardo Genovese actually is probably someone I should have mentioned in the underrated. He's a catching prospect I'm high on. I think it's overshadowed a bit. I think, frankly, international free agents who aren't of the caliber of Luciano actually tend to get overshadowed in prospect rankings just because, again, people don't know what to do with him in terms of not having the extended experience. We see these guys in college baseball, and it's weirder. It's a lot of guys get a $600,000, $800,000 bonus in international free agency, where with the draft, we could say this was a 3rd round pick or the 75th overall selection. And so it's just easier for, I think, people to form those into rankings. But, I really think there's almost zero thought that is going into that, other than when Michael Holmes is preparing to talk to reporters and knows the first question he's going to be asked is, what does this mean for Joey Bart? I think that's about the first time that's really coming into their radar. At least that's the sense I get from the organization. I don't think that that's a reflection of them being low on Bart or being especially high on Bailey. I think it's just them sort of every move they're making is going to be based off what their evaluation of the player is individually.
I think international free agents often get overlooked as well because we don't watch them on MLB Network, as we do the draft. We don't sit there and hear Greg Amsinger with his hair analyzing these prospects. It's just kind of like a very quiet, you could easily look past that notification on your phone that the Giants signed someone out of the Dominican Republic. It's very easy to overlook that piece of news. So, Marco Luciano, I wonder how many people knew that the Giants signed him. I want to go back and look at how many retweets that Alex Pavlovich tweet
It's a really good point. Yeah.
Because it probably got nothing because, people probably didn't care the way they care about the draft. And, as it turns out, international free agent signings are electric. I mean, they're some of the best players in the game. Juan Soto, Ronald Acuna, the list goes on and on. So it's definitely an interesting point. Let's talk about Will Wilson. I want to get Will Wilson real quick. Giants practically bought him from the Angels.
Yep.
Zach Cozart was, pretty much.
They immediately released it, right? Like
Yeah.
I was actually when they made the move, I'm like, this could really work out if Cozart is healthy. This could be an incredible trade. And then they just immediately cut Cozart, ending. And he thought, they basically paid $13 million to acquire Will Wilson.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't even know how to word Zach Cozart's tenure with the Giants. It was just not a tenure at all. It was just cut. So, I mean, he's probably embarrassed. Oh, geez, they did this for Will Wilson. But yeah, they did do it for Will Wilson.
Because he got released before the COVID season, he did not get his salary prorated. So he's got that full $13.3 million last season. I think he's doing fine.
Yeah, Zach Cozart's just fine. Exactly. But where does Will Wilson profile? I know I've heard him third baseman, second baseman, a guy who's even possibly on the fast track to the big leagues. I mean, give me a kind of a quick player profile on Will Wilson.
Yeah, I got to talk to Wilson. I did a profile of him, I want to say during last summer while he was at the alternate site. It might have been just after he switched from the alternate site over to Instructs. I guess depending on who you talk to, he's actually played a good amount of shortstop. I think the answer for the Giants is all of the above. I think it's going to be, when I talk to him, he goes, I've basically every day I'm playing some second, playing some short, playing some third. He was primarily getting reps at second and third, but he's also primarily played shortstop in the past. So I don't take that as them saying he's done playing short as much as they wanted to take advantage and give him as many reps as they could at the newer positions to get him used to that. I think it's really interesting with Wilson because his college profile and his small sample in the pros are very different. In college, he was supposed to be this above average hit and power tool guy who was going to, like you said, move very quickly. And then in his debut, and again, it was the year he was drafted. That's always a weird thing because you've basically played a collegiate baseball season. Now you got to go play a pro baseball season. There's obviously a lot of moving parts there, but he struggled at rookie ball relative to what you would expect from a first round pick who, had just been drafted out of college and performed quite well. And so, one thing is that he hit the ball on the ground a lot. The Giants have been working with him to try to improve his launch angle. That was one of the things he talked about. That, they showed him how many more expected extra base hits he would have had if he could have just, cut his ground ball rate in half, how vastly. I think that's ultimately how well he's able to make that adjustment is going to be key. Because if that's something that he can make by the start of whatever the next minor league season is, he's pretty much got this new swing that's driving the ball, that's elevating the ball more consistently. He's young. He's posted a strong, exit velocities pretty consistently. I think he will be on that fast track and he will be able to play kind of wherever the Giants need at the moment. But, it's a swing change. Like those are a lot easier said than done. And I think we could also expect to see him struggle with some swing and miss, struggle maybe with a high amount of pop outs, and stall a bit. So I think it's going to ultimately come down to how well the Giants, how well Wilson is able to make those adjustments.
Interesting. So yeah, I've always wondered about Will Wilson. I hadn't even taken a big look at him since they acquired him. So that's some interesting things about Will Wilson. So final question here, and this is a big one. Giants are close to winning. They're close to becoming that team that everybody's kind of hoping they want. You know, everybody's trying to erase these last 3-4 years, and they want a good team. You know, it's been a while, and I think the championships,
as every fan should. That's not. Yeah,
the championships really spoiled this fan base in particular, and they're hungry for it. They're hungry for Luciano. They're hungry for Ramos, Bart, Bailey, whatever you want to say. But there's some glaring, issues, as you mentioned, as you maybe did not include the strong positions in the farm system. In your article, you wrote about the most strong positions. So that leads us to free agency. So where do you see the Giants spending their money? Because there's a ton of money, as you and I have both heard a million times, money coming off the books with this pitching rotation that they just assembled this offseason. Longoria's got like another year or two after this, which I'm like Cueto, Belt, Crawford, Posey, all of them are going to be gone pretty much, or if brought back,
have to be on new contracts that should be substantially cheaper,
very substantially lower price for sure. Where do they spend their money, Mark? Because it's going to be a question that's going to be asked so much. Is it pitching? Because I know we just talked about how they don't have enough of it. Where are they spending it? That's a hard question.
Here's loaded. I'll try to answer it in pieces. The first part is if I was running the front office, and first let me adjust my bank account accordingly and get some other things in order. But the first would be, obviously pitching. And I think the problem is, and this is where I've started to look ahead to the celebrated 2021-2022 free agent class. It's not a deep pitching free agent group. It is a deep shortstop, deep position player group. And so, I'm curious to see how it handles. Last year, pretty early on in the season, I was saying the Giants should try to sign Kevin Gausman to a 3-year, $45 million extension last season, because my logic was, $15 million a year is not going to be a problem for them. It's not going to keep them from being aggressive, this coming off season. The second being, if he is really good, he's going to cost a lot more than $15 million a year, because again, I saw last off season, frankly, Gausman and Stroman were on par with Bauer for me. And that's before we get to the off-field stuff, why I was even, lower on Bauer, and why, again, you can read my articles on why I didn't think the Giants should sign Bauer. It's a separate thing. But even on field, Gausman and Stroman, I thought, had shown in their recent samples as well as their long-term to actually have an argument to be as good as Bauer. Again, just looking at on-field projections. So I thought the market for Gausman was going to be quite high. I think they're lucky to get him back on a qualifying offer. But if he repeats what he did last season over a 162 game season, I think that's where that is going to have to begin and end. They're going to have to re-sign, I think, Kevin Gausman. And so that's where it's going to be really interesting to see. Again, obviously they should target some of those young shortstops and some of those position player stars. But to, I guess, answer the question that more people care about, which is what Farhan Zaidi is going to do, I think it gets back to my answer to the question about Patrick Bailey and Joey Bart. And on my Sound the Foghorn podcast, this past week, I talked with Ginny Searle, associate editor over at Baseball Prospectus, and we were talking about the Giants and trying to figure out what they're going to do. And the thing that's so frustrating, sorry, I just showered and the hair is drying and falling on my face. I've been doing this for the past 30 minutes. Anyway, is
there a video component to this?
Is that the Giants, for fans who had the Brian Sabian and Bobby Evans regimes, essentially, that ran in a lot of the similar ways, especially at the big league level, fans always knew what was going to cap. Giants are going to be aggressive on the free agent market. Giants are going to be willing to trade their prospects for almost any established veteran who became available, especially if they played a position where they didn't have an already proven big league ready starter. Zaidi has pretty much, in my opinion, when it comes to roster construction, zero tendencies. I don't think he's inclined to spend in free agency in a particular way. I don't think he's inclined to make trades a certain way. I think Zaidi works from the premise of, like I talked about before, if we can get a better player than the cost it will take to get the better player, we are going to do that over and over again. Don't care where. And then we'll sort it out when we have to sort it out. And so to answer the question, it depends on, what these internal evaluations of prospects are, right? If I'm the Giants and I say, hey, Marco Luciano, I think he's going to be a really good player, but you know what? I don't think he's going to be a future star. I think he's more of an above average starter. I think Farhan Zaidi is going to say, hey, maybe we can take advantage, right, of this gap in our evaluation. This is something someone I talked to who was familiar with the Cubs front office talked about. The Cubs front office was lower on Gleyber Torres than consensus, their analytical models, and basically said that they thought Torres was going to be a really good player, but not necessarily going to be a Fernando Tatis Jr. or whatever. And that's what ultimately made it easier for them to pull the trigger on moving him for Chapman. We have no idea who those prospects are in the Giants system. We have no idea if the Giants have any of those prospects in the system. Maybe the Giants think everyone's overlooking their prospects and they have Kyle Harrison as an ace and, all these guys who are actually going to fill certain roles that we're not expecting. Because the problem is, like you said, because of all these free agents, you can look at no position. There are zero positions on this current Giants roster where I can point to the 2023 season and you can tell me with any certainty who's going to be starting there right now. And, again, I think it's frustrating for fans. It requires patience, but I also think we're approaching that point where I think we are, it's okay and justifiable to be more critical of Zaidi if we don't see him starting to put some of these chips in play this coming off season. Because if it's not spending in free agency for a pitcher, although to be fair, I mentioned it's weaker, there is Noah Syndergaard, and if he has a bounce back year, he could become a premium arm, and you never know with who could become available. But then if it's going to be on the trade market and elsewhere, I think it is getting to the point where when he came in, people said the Giants don't have many chips to play, so just wait it out, acquire all the chips you can. He's done a fantastic job of that. Mike Yastrzemski, Donovan Solano, all these, Sam Selman, all these different guys, all these different levels, Patrick Bailey in the draft and all these other things, Jalen Davis. But now he's accumulated these chips, and now we got to see how he starts playing them, right? That was something the Padres with AJ Preller, when he first got hired, it seemed like they had a top 10 system. They had some borderline big league talent, and Preller got aggressive quickly. And people forget about before the Padres built what looks like is going to be another dynasty in the NL West. They put all their chips on the table and signed James Shields and traded for the Upton brothers and, traded for Matt Kemp, traded Yasmani Grandal, by the way, to do it, and traded for Craig Kimbrell, only for it all to blow up and then Preller have to take it down. And he did so wonderfully. He got Fernando Tatis Jr. for Shields. He got a ton of prospects in doing so. And now he's built it the second time around. But, before he did this, I was telling a friend who was a Padres fan, I know Preller can acquire young talent. I know he can build a foundation. He can build a farm system. I don't know if he can build a contender. And I think we'll see how it plays out this year. I believe he's proven that, and the Padres are, set up well for the next number of years. Now, I think that question turns to Farhan Zaidi. I know he can acquire really good big league talent at a lot lower price than you'd expect through waivers, through these minor trades. I know he can accumulate depth and build a strong player development apparatus, or at least I feel fairly confident in that. What I don't know is how aggressive is he going to be in free agency? How aggressive is he going to be in trades to get the proven players who are going to have to come at a premium price? Who is he willing to do that for? Who isn't he willing to do that for? And ultimately, how good he is at doing that is going to determine if the Giants are able to get to the tier that the Padres and Dodgers are currently at.
So I don't think Zaidi will ever, I'm sure you're going to agree with me, I don't think Zaidi is going to go with a 10-year deal. And as you mentioned, there's no starting pitchers that would be even close, remotely close to receiving Max Scherzer or John Lester money. Mm-hmm. But it seems like those are the only two long-term starting pitching deals that have somewhat worked out. It's crazy. let's real quick before we. I know I said that was the
No,
last question.
you're all good. Hey, I got time. I pre-wrote a lot of stuff this morning so I could give myself some flexibility. So you're good. You got
There you
something
go.
else.
Shortstops. I mean
Mhm.
that's such an interesting thing because I think it all depends on how they view Luciano.
Yep.
But it's interesting because I don't see them going after. First of all, I think some of these guys are going to get re-signed. Lindor, I think, is pretty much locked to
Yeah.
get re-signed. Seager, I think, is not too far behind. But Seager and Correa, they're on their way to third base anyway, I think. So why would you sign, would they want to, if that's in the package and they say, why would I sign here? You have a top shortstop prospect right here who's pretty much going to play shortstop. That leaves me to be shifted over to third. I don't want to play here. So, these guys are going to want to they're going to end up moving to third base, but they're going to want to play shortstop
It's
for.
interesting. I mean, again, to be
Mhm.
fair, right? I think that's going to be a key question because I think the Giants' plan would be to sign one of these guys to play shortstop alongside Longoria,
Yeah.
hoping that Luciano is ready for 2020 to make a debut in 2022, but probably more realistically to be a legitimate contributor in 2023, when at that point they could head into the offseason planning to move the Seager, the Trevor Story, although Story's probably one of the guys who wouldn't have to move to third as quickly or whatever, move them to third for Luciano or slot Luciano in at third if they think, that's where he's ultimately going to end up.
Yeah. I think it all depends on how they view him. If there is a kind of a stopgap where Luciano is going to be a regular contributor, like you said, in 2023, would it be a bad move to sign a guy like Didi Gregorius to play shortstop for a year and then deal him? And then would that be something that you could see happening?
I could see again, like I've really struggled because I kind of make I love the prospect stuff. That's the passion, but I think I get the most clicks for my like rumor trade speculation, Giants move speculation stuff, and that's been the struggle when it comes to Zaidi because of that unpredictability. I mean, frankly, I don't think it's out of the question that Brandon Belt, Buster Posey, and Brandon Crawford are on the team next year, that they re-sign on one-year deals. I don't necessarily think it's particularly likely, but I don't think they've made any decision. Like, I don't think they were opposed to re-signing Madison Bumgarner. It's just once they saw where the market went, they were pretty content moving on. So, I do think there, I really think nothing's off the table in the most frustrating way possible for fans, because since nothing's off the table, you can discern virtually nothing from everything that's on.
Yeah, I think the only player out of all those guys I could see signing back is Brandon Belt because I think he most fits the mold of.
I agree. I think I think don't underestimate Posey because in part because again, people have talked about, Zaidi doesn't care about branding, marketing, blah, blah. That's Bumgarner walk. I disagree. I think Zaidi is not going to prioritize that over other things, but I do think that will be a tiebreaker. And, again, Joey Bart struggled last year. Like, there's no way around it. The Giants front office, I think the player development team, I think most around baseball, again, like I think most around baseball, by the way, would disagree with me that I think they'd say I'm too low on Bart. So I want to make that clear. I think most around baseball expect, Bart to be ready to be a big league everyday player next season, but it's not out of the question that, I mean, even if it's just an injury, I think it could delay the timeline a year, even if he is performing well. So, I think Posey isn't one to overlook. I think Posey is probably actually, I think it's more likely that the Giants want to bring Posey back and he decides to go elsewhere than the other way around.
Mark, do you play out of the park baseball?
I used to play it a lot more before I've been busy, but yes, I've played quite a bit.
I could just imagine you absolutely dominating that game completely. Just
I
dominating, not just like not the obvious parts of the game, but getting like a solid third player return in a trade. Just like
I spent
searching for
so
hours.
I spent so much time, right? Because it gives you the immediate trade reaction, right? So I just go through all the prospects and just add as many prospects as I could, as much cash as I could. Yes, I did. I spent a lot of time filling in the depth on in my organization.
Just hours trying to find like that third player in the deal. Like I could just imagine
who has like 2.5 instead of 2-star potential.
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
that minutia.
Exactly. That's awesome. Mark, I appreciate you coming on the show. A lot of great insight. We could sit here for hours and discuss the future of this team because in the future of the division for sure.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of fun. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me on. And again, to anyone out there who wants to check out the pieces we talked about, you can go on over to aroundthefoghorn.com or give me a follow on Twitter at Mad Delucchi. That is MADDELUCCHI.
Yeah, and I know the majority of you guys listening or watching probably thought it was Delucci. It's not. It's Delucchi. Okay. There's
That's
some
the breaking
things,
news.
yes. There's some things on the internet that you just flat out have not said out loud, like the guy's name from Baseball Prospectus that you
Yeah,
mentioned.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So, and yours is one of them. So I had to listen to a podcast of yours to get that right.
Hey, I could give you credit for coming in ready.
There we go. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe, like, do all that fun stuff. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. Even give us a review. More content on the way. A lot of fun stuff coming up. Be sure to keep up with us and follow us on social media at RizzoCast, RIZZOCAST. And if you're brave enough and if you're stupid enough, follow me on Twitter at Steven Rissotto, STEVENRISSOTTO. Thank you guys for listening and have a great day.